So, welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hiruki-Raring, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska and how we connect and work with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. Our speakers work for some part of NOAA or work in partnership with NOAA, and this year we're also aiming to present research conducted by students as well as established scientists. We hope this gives you a sneak peek at different career paths that you might be interested in. This school year, we're presenting short series of webinars that are more regionally based so that we can focus on topics of interest to those regions of Alaska. We're kicking off our year with a 2-webinar series on beluga whales with a focus on Cook Inlet belugas. Today, we're introducing you to Jill Seymour, who works for NOAA Fisheries Alaska Regional Office in Anchorage, Alaska, and Paul Wade, who works for NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, Washington. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we're all coming to you from traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that Jill and Paul's work is done in Cook Inlet, Alaska, the traditional lands of the Dena'ina, who have stewarded their lands and waters for thousands of years. Jill is presenting from Anchorage, from Dena'ina land, and Paul is presenting from, and we're hosting this webinar from, the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. We would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which will occur tomorrow, September 11th, 2021. We'd like to take a moment of silence on behalf of the victims who were lost as a result of the attack on September 11th, 2001, and their families. Okay, thank you for taking time to remember. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speaker. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions. We encourage you to ask them as we go, and my colleagues Story Oates and Mabel Baldwin-Schaefer and I will be keeping track for Jill and Paul. They'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We may not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, I'll hand it over to Jill to introduce herself.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm so excited that you are able to attend from near and far and join Paul and I in learning a bit about Cook Inlet belugas. I'm going to kick us off with a short overview about Cook Inlet belugas and describe some opportunities for folks to get involved in helping scientists with conservation of the species. And then I will pass the baton to Paul, who will get into more detail on some of the research that he conducts with the population. So first of all, a little bit about me. So I am a marine mammal scientist with NOAA Fisheries in Alaska, based out of Anchorage. And I'm also the Cook Inlet Beluga Whale Recovery Coordinator, which essentially means that I oversee all of the research and the recovery efforts associated with this population. I've wanted to be a marine mammal biologist since I could remember, even as young as 3 or 4, like in this photo. I've always loved the beach, and I was able to go to school and ultimately pursue a career with the species that I am so enamored of. But enough about me. we're all here to talk about beluga whales. So for those who might not be as familiar with beluga whales, they are a small species of whale. They're usually white or gray, and they are closely related to another really cool whale species, the narwhal, which you can see a beluga in the top part of this picture and a narwhal with the funky tusk in the bottom part of the picture. Both these species of whales live in the Arctic, and they're very well adapted to a cold, icy climate. Now, you may have heard belugas are often called the canaries of the sea, and that's because they make a variety of sounds, including those to communicate with one another, as well as special types of calls called echolocation, which they use to help them find fish and other prey to eat. So Alaska is very blessed to have 5 different groups of beluga whales, which you can see on the map here. And we are, of course, today focusing on the Cook Inlet population down south. And the one thing I want you guys to note here is this big peninsula, this landmass that extends out and even off the map much farther out to the west. And that landmass separates that Cook Inlet population from all of the other populations of belugas in Alaska. And what this means is that NOAA Fisheries refers to the Cook Inlet beluga population as a distinct population segment. And that means that they are isolated geographically and genetically from those other populations you saw on the map. They would literally have to travel around that peninsula in order to interact with those other populations. But they don't do that. They live year-round in Cook Inlet. So why are we concerned about Cook Inlet beluga whales? Why are we presenting to you today about this population? Can anybody give me some guesses? And you can write your answers in the chat.
So those of you in the audience, if you can think of some of the reasons that we might be concerned about Cook Inlet belugas, some of you might have seen our webinar from last year about Cook Inlet belugas and remembered something about what's going on with Cook Inlet belugas. For some of you, it might be something new to you, but if you want to type into the question box what you think is going on with Cook Inlet belugas, Madison is asking, are they endangered? And we have some other folks who are saying, oh, Mabel and Ruby are saying they are endangered. And let's see, Kyle, Jordan, and Kaylee are also asking if they're endangered. Garrett is saying that it might be due to climate change and warm water. And Liam is saying that maybe they're overhunted for food. And Mabel and Ruby are also saying maybe it's because they're a distinct population segment and they're all alone and not connected to the other populations. So what can you tell us about that, Jill?
Absolutely. I think you guys got a sneak peek at my presentation in advance because yes, the reason we are very concerned about Cook Inlet belugas is because they are endangered. And so they are federally protected under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And the reason why they were listed is because back in the late 70s, scientists estimated that there were about 1,300 Cook Inlet belugas. And this is a map of Cook Inlet here. And this is the estimated area where you could usually find Cook Inlet belugas, both the gray and the gray stripes, back in the 70s. And all these little circles represent sightings that scientists made of the belugas. So we did find them in other areas, but we usually saw them up in this region. Now, currently, what we see and what scientists have estimated is that the population is less than 300 individuals, and that's a very dramatic decline. And so they were listed as endangered due to that population decline. Another thing that scientists saw as they continued to monitor and survey this species through that decline is that the belugas range shrunk. You did not see belugas very often anymore down in this middle section of Cook Inlet. They concentrated up in and around Anchorage, and Anchorage, Alaska is the largest city in Alaska. And there's a lot of human activity that goes on in that area, including a large shipping port, fishing activities, and a big airport. So what this means is that the belugas are using less habitat and they're overlapping more with all of this human activity. And we had someone mention that one of the reasons they thought we were concerned about belugas was due to overhunting, and that is correct. The hypothesis is that the population originally declined due to overhunting or overharvest by native and local subsistence communities. So harvest for personal use and harvest for cultural purposes. And those communities actually in 1999 voluntarily stopped hunting in hopes that the population would begin to recover. And that's what everybody thought. Once the hunting stopped, the population would grow again. And unfortunately, that's not what we've seen. Even without hunting, the population is still decreasing. So we have many scientists at NOAA Fisheries, Paul is one, and also our partners who are hard at work right now conducting a lot of research to try and figure out why the population isn't increasing. And these are some photos of some of the kinds of research that we do. We do boat and aircraft and shoreline-based surveys looking for belugas. Cook Inlet is also a very muddy, silty water body. And so when it can be hard to see belugas, so we also deploy, there's my cursor, acoustic recording equipment. So this is an underwater microphone that can record those canaries of the sea as they make calls. We also look at what prey are available to them. So you have some fish down here in this net. And we look at things like contaminants and pollution in water and in the prey to see if that's a concern. And we also monitor the health and prevalence of disease in the whales. And then we conduct research also on genetics and explore the potential for climate change to impact the population. So there's a lot going on. Researchers are very hard at work. And that's where you guys can come in. So you can help scientists recover Cook Inlet belugas. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You can, if you are in the Anchorage area or the Cook Inlet area, or you come to Alaska to visit, you can go out and look for belugas. And we have an online platform where you can report your sightings to NOAA scientists. You can attend our outreach events, in particular Belugas Count, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, or join our citizen science monitoring program, which I'll talk more at length about later. You can share information about Cook Inlet belugas with your friends and family, because the more people that know about these Cook Inlet belugas and that they're endangered and that people are hard at work trying to recover them, the more people can get involved in that effort. And NOAA has set up a website here, or you can also just Google Help Belugas NOAA, and this website should pop up for you. And it contains a lot of helpful information, things like safer boating practices. If you're out on a boat in Cook Inlet beluga habitat and you see whales, what do you do to make it safer for them? So there are a lot of ways that you can get involved. Now I want to talk a little bit about our Belugas Count event. This is our biggest outreach event. It's something we're very proud of. We have over 20 partners that help NOAA Fisheries put this event on. It's been ongoing since 2017 and thousands of people attend. It usually involves monitoring in the morning at stations set up throughout Cook Inlet, meeting beluga researchers and helping them look for beluga whales. And then in the afternoon, everyone goes to the Alaska Zoo, where there are more opportunities to interact with scientists as well as engage in interactive activities to learn more about belugas. It's an incredible event, and it usually happens right around this time of year. Well, we know that the COVID pandemic has been ongoing for quite some time. And unfortunately, last year and this year, we made the hard decision with our partners to cancel this large event. We want everybody to be safe and healthy, and we just wanted everyone to be able to practice COVID safety. So we are not having the event this year. However, we are encouraging people If you live near Cook Inlet or you visit Cook Inlet area, you and your family and friends can still go out to these monitoring stations and look for belugas. So we have a website set up for that. It's at the bottom of the screen here. And it includes this map, which has some locations identified on it that we recommend members of the public can go to look for belugas. Usually you're going to want to look for them about 3 to 4 hours before high tide, and the website will help you identify when that might be, depending on what location you want to go to. And of course, if you observe beluga whales, we want you to report them, and you can do that at cookinletbelugas.com. It's very easy. We want to know where you saw them, when you saw them, what they were doing, and how many. And so that's a very brief overview of our belugas and also our belugas count event. And there are some websites here that you can go to learn more information about belugas. I also want to encourage everybody to check out the Belugas Count Facebook page. It's a great page to follow, even though we're not having the event this year. It is still very active with a lot of posts about ongoing research and great pictures of belugas that people are submitting to NOAA Fisheries.
And Jill, I also wanted to mention that that we put all of these links on the NOAA Live Alaska webpage underneath the listing for this webinar. So they're all on the website as well.
Thank you so much. Yes. And I'm going to talk a little bit next about our citizen science program as well, but before I do that, are there any questions that we have about what I've already covered?
So one of the questions that I had, Jill, was what do you use the sightings for that people send in? How is that information used? And for anybody else who has questions about the things that Jill had just talked about, if you want to just type them into the chat, we can read them off from there.
Sure. So I'll be getting into that more when I talk about the citizen science program, but the sightings that people submit just when they're out and about on their own and they see belugas all get compiled by beluga scientists into a master database, and that information is used by NOAA Fisheries for conservation management and research purposes. So, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes.
Okay, and we had a couple of questions about sounds. Mabel and Ruby had asked what the microphone that you talked about was called, and I had said that it was a hydrophone. Do you have another term for it?
Hydrophone is a good general term for it. If our marine acoustician was here, he could tell you the exact make and model, and Paul might be able to chime in. We have a couple of different kinds of recording equipment out there due to the dramatic tides and the very thick mud and rocky shorelines. Depending on where we place the acoustic equipment, we use different kinds, because some we have to attach to rocks and others we kind of drill down in the sediment to install so that it doesn't get washed out with the extreme tides that we see in Cook Inlet.
And so that might actually be part of the answer to Garrett's question. He had asked, how do you track the sounds if you're not in the water?
Yes, so it's actually like an underwater recorder. So once we periodically the researchers periodically have to go out to where the recorder is and collect the recording off of the equipment. And then they take it back to the office or the lab and they listen to what has been recorded. So, and that's how we do that. It makes for a lot of exciting boat and helicopter trips to get out to where those recorders are at.
Right. So Liam had a question about belugas' behavior. He was wondering, do belugas swim from humans, or do they flee from humans when they see them?
Sure, that's a really great question. Just like a lot of other animals, it can depend on the beluga. We have sometimes had like younger belugas that are a little bit curious about research vessels when our researchers are out looking from a boat looking for belugas. And There's all sorts of rules that those researchers, of course, have to follow to make sure that they're not bothering the belugas. But sometimes belugas will approach the boat and kind of check it out because they're curious. Other times we do see belugas avoid humans and human activity. They won't maybe come as close. One of the things that we are very interested and do a lot of research with is understanding how belugas respond to human-produced noise, like dock construction, that can generate a lot of noise underwater. So, but yeah, it can vary, and every beluga is a little bit different, probably, just like every human is.
Right. And Verena, one of our Cook Inlet Beluga colleagues, had said that the photo of the hydrophone that you showed was of an F pod. I don't know what that
Thank you.
means.
An
Is that the
F
model
pod is
number?
one of the several types of recording equipment that they use. So thanks, Verena, for chiming in with that.
All right. Okay, so I have a few more questions before we move on, but Krista was wondering, how do you count the belugas if you don't know exactly where they are?
Yeah, that's hard. So we do that a couple of ways. We have researchers from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center who conduct aerial surveys periodically every other year. At the same time of year, they go out and they basically zigzag all the way up and down Cook Inlet in a standardized manner so that they're consistent each year that they go out and do that, looking for and counting whales and taking video and photography that they can review later on to double check themselves. We also have winter aerial flights. We partner with another federal agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and have researchers go looking for the whales during the winter months. And that is more aimed at looking less about counting the whales and more at trying to understand the habitat use in the winter time. And then we also have work with boat-based and shore-based counts as well. So, but the main source of the estimates comes from those aerial flights.
Great. And I just realized that Krista is the teacher of a fifth and sixth grade class in Anchorage. So that's where all of these questions are generated from. And so somebody in Krista's class was asking, what do you do with the belugas after you find them? And that was related to another question that Madison had asked, which was, do you interact directly with the belugas?
Okay. Well, so when we are encountering, when our researchers are out and they encounter live belugas, what happens is going to be dependent upon the kind of research. If it's where they're just flying looking, or they're from a boat looking, then they're going to follow NOAA Fisheries guidelines that we have set up to ensure that the researchers being there disturbs the whales as little as possible. We don't want to bother them. And of course, the researchers are interested in observing their natural behavior. So to avoid disturbing them is paramount. And then I'm trying to remember the second part of the question.
Oh, so I think you answered the second question with what you said, because the question was, do you interact directly with the belugas?
Yes. So there are occasions where we do interact with the belugas. We do occasionally have research where we might try to get a small tissue sample from a living beluga. In those cases where we're interacting directly with them, the decision to allow researchers to do that undergoes a lot of review and scrutiny, because we definitely want to take good care of this small number of whales that we have left, and we don't want to bother them unduly. And that process, when we do take a sample of tissue, is quite painless for them. And then the other situation where we might interact with a beluga is Cook Inlet belugas. It's not uncommon for them to strand. As the tide goes out, they can get stuck on mud flats. And they're actually, as far as whales go, pretty well adapted to being able to handle being stranded. So these mud flats typically have kind of deep channels within them that can hold water. They just don't form a pathway of water all the way to the deeper water where the rest of the ocean still is at low tide. So we have situations where we have belugas strand and we have trained individuals, trained professionals who understand how to care for the belugas and monitor them and make sure that they're doing okay. So when the tide comes back in, the belugas hopefully will rescue themselves by swimming out. So that's another situation where we do interact directly with them.
Great. Well, we have a couple of questions, but I think I might hold on to those until after the next section because I know you have some more stuff to share with us.
Sure, that sounds good. So I'm going to jump into talking a little bit about our citizen science monitoring program. And so this is kind of the next step up from for the public in terms of ways that you can be involved in helping scientists learn more about Cook Inlet belugas. So this is the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Partnership. And this is actually a picture, by the way, of I and some volunteer monitors out last weekend. So sometimes the weather is this nice, and for those of you who've spent time in Anchorage, you know sometimes the weather this time of year is a little more rainy, but we had a great afternoon and evening of monitoring. So what is the Alaska Beluga Monitoring Partnership, or as we like to call it, AKBMP? So it is a multi-partner or collaboration between NOAA Fisheries and the partners you see listed here. It was formed in June 2019. And it serves to recruit and train members of the public as volunteer citizen scientists. And these volunteer citizen scientists go out to established monitoring sites throughout Cook Inlet, and they look for Cook Inlet belugas and record data for us. So we have 5 stations set up for monitoring throughout Cook Inlet, Ship Creek up by Anchorage, all the way down to the Kenai River and Kasilof River. And we And we have 2 monitoring seasons. We have a fall season that's underway right now that goes from mid-August to mid-November. And then just this year, we were able to start a spring monitoring season from March 15th to May 15th. And as a volunteer, what you end up doing and what you can expect is to go out for a 2-hour-long window at the monitoring site and look for belugas using binoculars, using just your eyes. And those sessions are scheduled around a tidal schedule because that can influence when we know belugas might be in that area. So just to give you an idea of how many people we already have engaged in this process. So we've had 2 fall seasons in our 3rd season, and then we've had the 1 spring season, and we've had a large number of volunteers. Even during the COVID pandemic, when people have been kind of staying home and sheltering in place, we've still managed to collect hundreds of hours worth of monitoring. And that's really amazing to see. So what the volunteers are doing when they're out there looking for belugas is they're collecting data. So they're collecting information on the number of animals they see, how long the animals are in the area. We also ask them to look and tell us what the colors of the belugas are, because white belugas tend to be adult belugas and the gray ones tend to be younger. And the darker, I think Paul's going to talk about this more, but the darker they get in color, the younger they tend to be. And that gives researchers an idea of the age composition of the population. We also want to know what kind of behavior they're exhibiting, and that tells us a lot about how they utilize the habitat, if they're just always traveling through or if they're hanging out in the area. Are they chasing fish in the area? That might mean it's an important feeding spot. We also want to know about what human activity is occurring, and we want to know that regardless of whether you see whales or not, because that could be an indication that maybe they're avoiding that area when there's a lot of a certain kind of human activity. We also like to know what other kinds of marine mammals are observed. A lot of times you see harbor seals in the same areas as beluga whales. They tend to feed on similar kinds of fish. And we always like to hear about human beluga interactions. For example, if belugas are hanging out near a boat launch and someone is launching a boat, with the belugas right there, that's something we like to know about. It helps us understand where there might be opportunities for more public outreach and education. So this figure shows just sort of a visual for you of the 5 different monitoring sites and how much variation there can be. So this is gives you a visual of how many sessions were monitored at each site the last 2 fall seasons. And the gray lines here indicate sessions where the volunteer citizen scientists did not see any beluga whales. And the blue ones show where they did see, when they did see beluga whales. So you can see there's a lot of variation among the sites, not just in terms of how often whales were seen, but we definitely have some sites where we need more volunteers. We need more eyes on the water, and maybe because we don't have as many eyes on the water, we are missing out on when the whales are in those areas. So keep that in mind. There's definitely a need for extra eyes. So when our monitors are out there and they're seeing belugas, they're seeing a lot of different kinds of things. First off, they're seeing behavior, like I mentioned before, and the most common behaviors they tend to see are traveling, milling, or just kind of the whales are hanging out in the area, diving, and suspected feeding. And as I mentioned before, knowing what kind of behaviors they're exhibiting at these different sites gives us some insight as researchers into how they're using the habitat. And then, of course, looking at what different age classes are present. Our observers most commonly see adult beluga whales. That's because they're the biggest and they tend to be bright white. So they're easier to see against that muddy water. You can see it's easier to see this white whale, even though he or she is behind this gray whale against that muddy watercolor. And then the other age class that is very commonly seen are juveniles, or younger animals, and they are a gray, but they're still quite large. We also do see calves. I just saw a calf when I was out monitoring yesterday. They're adorable. They're a little harder to see because they are darker and they are smaller and they don't come up quite as high out of the water often, but we do see them and they're cute. And then, of course, I mentioned before, we are interested in knowing about the human activity. And one of the things that's really interesting about our monitoring sites is the kinds of activities we see vary depending upon the site. So Ship Creek is a site that is right by the Port of Alaska and the Anchorage Airport. And so there's a lot of vessel traffic there. There's aircraft traffic. There's also things like dock activity and construction because there's construction going on at the port. And then when you look at some of the other locations like mile marker 95.3 and 20 mile, those are right along the highway in Turnagain Arm, and there's also a railroad that goes right there. So there's a lot of vehicle and train noise. And even though those noises are produced above water, they are still audible to the belugas in the water. And then 20 Mile and Kenai are both, and Ship Creek also actually are both all locations where there are boat launches. So you see a lot of motorized and also non-motorized watercraft in those locations as well. So there's a lot going on. It's a busy place, Upper Cook Inlet. And then this gets back to the question I gave a brief answer to earlier, where do all these data go? And as I mentioned, the data gets compiled and our monitoring coordinator compiles and writes reports with the data that is shared with researchers and beluga managers like myself and others at my office, and it informs us of certain things. So for example, if the results show that belugas tend not to be in a certain area at a certain time of year, and there's a company that wants to do a construction project in the water there, we might be able to say, well, you could do your construction project, but can you do your construction project at this time of year, because we know the belugas are less likely to be there, and that helps reduce human impact on the belugas. So this kind of information is really critical for NOAA Fisheries to be able to make those kinds of recommendations. So if you are interested in becoming a volunteer with AKBMP, you can go to the AKBMP website, which is listed here. And there is about 1 to 2 hour training that is pre-recorded that you can take at your leisure that is on the website. And then you will get connected with the monitoring coordinator, Maddie Cosma, and she can set you up to help become a citizen scientist. And even if you're not able to join as a citizen scientist with AKBMP, we highly recommend that you follow the AKBMP Facebook page, which is Alaska BMP. It's a very active page, and there's constantly new posts showing our citizen scientists at work, and also all the great belugas and sometimes other animals and things like sunsets that they are getting to see. So that wraps up my little tutorial on the Citizen Science Monitoring Program. And again, you can reach out to Maddie if you have questions specific to that program. And I guess I'll take any questions that anybody has.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that that have come in. Winter was wondering, are Cook Inlet whales resident or migratory?
That's an excellent question. So Cook Inlet belugas don't migrate. They stay in Cook Inlet year round. There are certain parts of the inlet that they like to congregate in at certain times of year, but you can find them pretty much, and again, like I mentioned earlier, they tend to be more commonly observed in the upper inlet up in and around Anchorage, but you can find them anywhere within Cook Inlet at any time of year, but they're always staying within the inlet.
Great. Michelle was also wondering, do any other kinds of whales come into Cook Inlet? Because you had mentioned that you look for harvest, whether there are other marine mammals near the belugas.
Yes. Yeah, so we do occasionally see other whales in the inlet. A lot of them tend to stay in the lower Cook Inlet because the tides are not as extreme down there, and some of these whales are much larger. So if they got stranded, it would be really bad for them. But we do see humpback whales and fin whales, and occasionally we will see killer whales in the inlet as well. So we do see those around.
Great. I didn't realize that killer whales were seen there. That's interesting.
Yes.
And Krista's class was wondering, how do you know that it's not the same whale being counted more than once when you're counting them?
That is tricky. So that is part of the training that AKBMP provides. And when you are out watching the whales as they surface, you can tend to get a sense, they surface usually with some level of regularity. So if you're looking at a group of whales, you can tend to get a sense of like, oh, that's a different whale because there's no way that whale just surfaced. So it's very unlikely that it's surfacing like just again. And as you're watching them too, occasionally they'll kind of all come up one right after another to breathe. And so you can kind of go 1, 2, 3 before they all go back down under the water again. So it's a matter of continuing to watch them, and then it's always kind of your best guess as to how many animals there are. But as you watch them and you get experience with that, you get more skilled at giving that estimate.
Great. And then one last question before we switch over to Paul. Alice was wondering, what do you look for with photo ID?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. And if I had another hour, I would have talked more about that. But so the photo ID, the photos that are taken by the researchers and oftentimes by AKBMP volunteers who have good quality cameras, are the Cook Inlet beluga whales actually have unique identifying marks on them, whether it's, a scar or a change in pigment or something like that. And so we have actually a photo catalog, and we're able to identify individual whales. And we have a long-standing project that's been ongoing since 2005, where we have a researcher that goes out and collects photographs of whales throughout Cook Inlet beluga whales throughout the inlet. And she's able to match up photos among years. and that tells us information about things like how long the whales are surviving. And it also can tell us things like, is the whale with this particular mark a female or a male? Because we might see them in a certain year with a calf by their side. So we can learn a lot of information from those photographs.
Great.
And
Well,
if you want to learn more about that project, you can go to cookinletbelugas.com. That's the main web page for that photo identification. It's pretty cool.
Great. Good to know. Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. I think that we will switch over to Paul, so I will make him the presenter, and then we can get into some of the research that we've been doing. So, okay, Paul, so we're seeing your here comes your presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, we're seeing your desktop right now. There we go.
Yeah.
Looks good.
I got stymied there trying to get things going. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Paul Wade. Thank you for tuning in to listen to us talk about Cook Inlet belugas, and I'm going to tell you about a little bit of our research that we have going on. I want to tell you about some new methods we have for studying living beluga whales. In the past, we can only estimate the age of whales by getting one of their teeth and slicing it in half and counting growth layers in the tooth, and I'll show you that in just a second. And we can usually only do that with a dead whale, though. But we've recently developed new methods that let us estimate the age of living whales. And then we've also developed methods that let us determine whether a female is pregnant or not. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. But first, I want to just tell you a little bit about myself. When I was 5 years old, yeah, that's me in the picture, even though it's kind of fuzzy. I lived on the beach, so the ocean is in my blood, I guess. After college, I had the chance to do some really cool snorkeling and scuba diving and got to see some amazing marine life. And that really got me hooked on studying marine biology. I've had a fantastic career with NOAA Fisheries, and it's given me the chance to spend well over a year of my life at sea studying whales, which has been, I've gotten to do some really wonderful things like do research on killer whales out in the Aleutian Islands and get up close to them. And then more recently, I've gotten the chance to conduct fieldwork with beluga whales in Cook Inlet. In 2017, I took over as our lead for doing research on Cook Inlet beluga whales. And it's been a really great experience. These days, if I'm not in the mountains, I want to be on the water somewhere, preferably with my dog, who likes to go with me everywhere. So that's just a little bit about myself. All right. So you've already been hearing a little bit about beluga whales and Cook Inlet belugas. When belugas are born, as Jill mentioned, they're a dark gray, as you can see at the top of this slide here. And as they grow older, moving down to the bottom of the slide, they become lighter in color until they're white as adults at the bottom. So their color and size tells us something about their relative age, but it's much more useful for us if we can figure out how many years old they are. So for example, we'd like to know exactly how old the whales are when they become light gray or when they become fully white in color. Well, in 2017, we started a biopsy sampling survey where we can collect a small piece of skin and blubber from a living whale, and we can learn a lot of different things from that small sample. On the left there, by the blue bar that says skin, we analyze 8 different things from the skin, and then over on the right, there's 3 different things that we can learn from the blubber. I don't have time to tell you about all of them, but just one example, we can tell whether a whale is male or female from the skin sample using genetics. And we can figure out many other things that I don't have the time to tell you about now. I am going to tell you about 2 of the things we've learned, including our latest discovery that we can tell how old each whale is. So our colleague Eleanor Boers led this project where we have learned how to estimate the age of beluga whales from a small piece of skin using something called epigenetics, which I'll try and explain in just a second. We just published this paper last March in a scientific journal. Now, some of you may know that genetics is the study of our DNA and our genes. Our genes control a lot about how we develop. So as an example, we have a gene that controls the color of our eyes. Well, what's epigenetics? Epigenetics is a relatively new field of scientific study, Epigenetics is the study of how your environment or behavior can cause changes to the way your genes work, especially about how genes are turned on and off. You may not know this, but some of our genes get turned on and off all the time for lots of different reasons. One good example is that as kids, we have a gene that causes us to produce a chemical called lactase, which allows us to digest milk, because of course kids drink milk. However, as kids grow to be adults, in some people this gene is turned off and they don't produce lactase anymore, and those adults can no longer drink milk without feeling sick. So that's just one example of genes get turned on and off. Now, one type of epigenetics that has had a lot of research go on is that there is a small chemical group called a methyl group that can attach to our DNA. It does this without changing our DNA sequence, and these chemical changes help turn the genes on and off. They basically control the genes. Now, some genes get turned on more the older we get, such as genes that help repair cells that have been damaged. So the way we create an epigenetic clock is to find these genes that get turned on as we get older. We can look across all the cells in a small skin sample and see what percentage of them are turned on, meaning they have a methyl group attached. And this is what we call the methylation rate. Now, to make this work, we have to set or calibrate our epigenetic clock. Like when you buy a watch, you first have to set it to the correct time. We have to set the methylation rate so we know how many years it means. So, for example, we need to figure out that a 5-year-old whale might have a 20% methylation rate and that a 30-year-old whale has a 60% methylation rate. And that way we can translate from the methylation rate back to how old they are. So we do this by using whales whose age we already know from another method. We can only do this with dead whales where we can get one of their teeth. We can cut the tooth in half and count the number of layers in the tooth. You can see that in the photo to the left there. All those lines coming out point to different layers in the teeth. Beluga whales lay down 2 layers in their tooth for every year they're alive. So we can count the layers and know how old they are. So this is much like counting the rings of a tree to see how old the tree is, because they do the same thing and lay down a layer every year. So we've done that looking at this methylation rate at a bunch of different genes, and then we've used a lot of statistics to find out which genes had the highest correlation with age. And we put together a model to predict the age from actually 29 different genes. We call these the CPG sites. This graph shows how we have set the epigenetic clock, where the tooth age is along the bottom axis and the epigenetic age is along the left axis. And using this graph, we can now estimate the age of the whales very accurately from just the epigenetics. Very exciting for us. All right, so now we can go out and estimate the age of living whales from that skin that we collect in a biopsy sample. This is a distribution of the ages of living whales in the population that we've sampled so far. In this graph, it's called a histogram, and the age is along the bottom axis there, and the number of whales, the count of whales, is what goes up on the left axis there. In the population we've sampled so far, the youngest whale we found is 8 years old, and the oldest is 28 years old in Cook Inlet Beluga. Now, just to show you some examples, here's a picture of the 8-year-old we sampled, and you can see that this is a small dark gray juvenile whale, which is what you expect. And then here's a picture of the 28-year-old we sampled, and it's a big white adult whale as we would expect. So that just gives you an idea of how this works. So now going back to this slide, one thing we can do is now we'll be able to put an age range on these different color categories, and that will allow us to do a better job of figuring out how old the whales are just from photographs. All right, well, what else can we do once we know the ages of the living whales? Well, here's just one example. We have a colleague, Nick Keller, who is from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in San Diego, and he studies hormones in whales. Hormones are chemicals made in one part of your body that travel to another part of your body to help control how your cells and organs do their work. For example, there are hormones that tell your body to grow and then tell your body to stop growing when you become an adult. One hormone that Nick looks at is called progesterone, and it's produced when a female becomes pregnant. So we can use the amount of progesterone in our biopsy sample to tell us if a female beluga is pregnant or not. And so far, out of all the whales we've tested so far, 4 of the 15 females were pregnant when we sampled them. But now that we also know the ages of the whales, we can plot the progesterone level versus age. So I'm putting a red line on here. Along the bottom there is our estimated age from the epigenetics, and going up the axis is the level of, on the left is the level of progesterone. And those blue dots are every whale that we sampled and measured its progesterone. And any blue dot that is above the red line is pregnant, and any blue dot that is below the red line is not pregnant. And now that we plotted against age, we see something more interesting that we didn't know before. So if you look at this, the range of where this blue bar is, that's age 10 to 20. And you can see in there that only 1 out of the 10 whales was pregnant. But to the right of that, 3 out of the 5 whales older than age 20 were pregnant. So a lot more of the older whales are getting pregnant. Now, this is actually really different from a healthy population of beluga whales in the eastern Chukchi Sea up in the northern slope of Alaska, where more than half the whales aged 10 to 20 were pregnant. So that's really different. So we need to collect more data, because this is a small sample size, to see if this is really what is going on. But if so, it means that most cook inlet belugas have a long delay until they start reproducing. This may mean that the population's not producing enough beluga calves for the population to grow and recover. Now we have to figure out why they're not reproducing until later. Now that we have to figure that out, we have several hypotheses we're looking at to explain why they're not able to produce calves until they're older than in other populations. So that's something we're trying to look at now. All right, so just to finish up, we're always looking for new ways to study cook inlet beluga whales so we can figure out why they're declining, and so we can try and promote their recovery. And that's just a little bit that I was able to tell you about. We have a lot more going on, but that's all I have time for. So thank you for listening to me, and I'd be happy to take any questions if you have some.
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions coming in. Mabel and Ruby were wondering, do all whales grow new layers on their teeth every year?
Well, that's a good question. You may know that we have kind of 2 big categories of whales. We have baleen whales that don't have any teeth. They just have baleen in their mouth, which is like long fingernail-like material. And then the other big category is toothed whales. But in the toothed whales, yes, they all grow layers in their teeth. So any kind of toothed whale, which could be a porpoise or a dolphin or a sperm whale, we can estimate their age by counting those layers in the teeth, just like the beluga.
Great. And then we have a couple of questions from Krista's class. One of the questions was, how do they age in color? So how does the maybe it's how does the color change as they age? Or yeah, I'm not quite sure. The question was, how do they age in color? But I was not sure exactly what the
Well, I think I understand what he's asking, which is, how does that actually happen, that they get lighter through time? And I have to be honest and tell you, I don't know a lot about that. And I'm not even sure that people have studied that, but I bet people in the aquariums have. But I think it probably has to do with, I know in many different kinds of animals, they can change the amount of pigment that's in their skin. And so it's probably related to that.
Right. And then another of Krista's students was wondering, and if you want to turn off your screen, you can, and that way you'll be full screen. Your camera will be full screen. Another of Krista's students was wondering, how do you know if the beluga is female or male? And I think you were saying that you could do that find that out from the tissue sample. Is that correct?
Yeah, we collaborate with geneticists, and the genetics people have figured out how to tell whether a whale is male or female just from the genetics. So as long as we get that skin sample, we can tell whether they're male or female from that.
Great. And then another of Krista's students was asking, besides salmon, do they eat anything else?
Yes, they eat a whole bunch of other things besides salmon, but you're right, in summer, salmon is their main prey. But they also feed on a small smelt type fish called a hooligan or eulachon that is in Cook Inlet. But at other times of year, or perhaps throughout the year, they feed on some bottom fish like cod and saffron cod and some other species like that, flounder. And they also feed on shrimp and some other crustaceans like that.
Great. And then Garrett was wondering, do you ever use robots in your research?
No, we don't use robots. We do use drones. Some of those nice overhead pictures I've been showing you were photographed from a drone that we fly. But no, we don't use robots yet. That would be really cool though if we did.
And then Michelle was wondering whether belugas breach as part of their behavior.
You know, you're right. A lot of whales breach. Belugas don't breach that often. I'm trying to think back. They will come surging a little higher out of the water sometimes when they get excited or trying to do something, and they'll stick their tail fluke out of the water sometimes. But I don't think I've ever seen a beluga breach completely out of the water like a lot of whales do. Like I'm sure you've seen pictures of humpback whales doing that because humpbacks do that quite spectacularly. But no, so they don't. Belugas do not breach in that same way, at least not our Cook Inlet belugas.
I did not know that. That's interesting. Mabel and Ruby were wondering what are some other animal species that don't reproduce until a later age, and it seems to me that a lot of whale species tend to breed at a later age.
Yeah, a lot of what we call the social toothed whales, like killer whales and false killer whales, a lot of them have life histories that are very similar to human, so they don't really not capable of having reproducing until they're say age 15 or 20 or older. And that's also very true of bowhead whales that live up in the North Slope of Alaska. There's been some fascinating studies that show that they can live a very long time, to more than 100 years, and one whale was even estimated to be almost 200 years old. But it seems as part of being a really long-lived animal like that, they don't start reproducing until they're more than 20 years old.
Wow, that's pretty old.
It is. Yeah.
So another of Krista's students was wondering, have submarines ever been used to study belugas?
Not in Cook Inlet that I know of. I'm trying to think of other areas. No, not really. I haven't actually heard too much about submarines being used for studying any kind of whales. Submarines aren't usually very fast, so whales and dolphins can usually swim away from them if they want to, but so maybe that's why people haven't used submarines. But that's a real interesting question. I never even thought of that.
And then another of Krista's students was wondering, how do you know where to look for belugas? Are they mostly along the shoreline, or can they be anywhere in the inlet?
So yeah, they could be anywhere in the inlet, but they're pretty predictable, especially in summer. And in summer, they're almost always really close to shore. And where they're really close to shore is along river mouths of the salmon or eulachon that they're trying to feed. They'll even swim up into the rivers. So at low tide, they kind of gather at the river mouth because they can't go up the river because the river delta actually will go dry, like in Turnagain Arm or out on the Susitna River Delta or up in Kinnickarm. So they have to retreat out to deeper water right at the edge of where the mudflats go dry. But then on the high tide, they'll move back up into the river. And what they're doing is they're feeding on the salmon that are swimming up that river too. You probably know that salmon live out in the ocean for a few years, but they were born in the rivers and they have to come back into the rivers to reproduce. And the belugas are taking advantage of the fact that the salmon get kind of concentrated in the river, and it's easier for the belugas to catch them there. So that's what's going on there. So the famous thing in Anchorage is that you can go out on the highway along Turnagain Arm, like Jill was talking about, and look for them like out around Bird Point and the mile marker Jill mentioned. And it's very predictable because they can't be up in Turnagain Arm at low tide because there's not enough water for them. So they kind of show up around Bird Point about an hour or two after the low tide in Anchorage. And as Jill said, it's about 3 to 4 hours before the high tide happens up in Turnagain Arm. So they are really predictable in those ways for the most part, especially in the summertime where we know so much about what they do and what they eat.
Great. Thank you. So we're coming right up to our 3 o'clock deadline, 3 o'clock Seattle deadline, 2 o'clock Alaska time deadline. So I think that we will wrap up here, and thank you for everybody who submitted questions, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, But thank you, Paul, and thank you, Jill, for sharing information, all this information with us. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to let our audience know that we have another webinar on Tuesday. Coral Pazzi, who was a student at Alaska Pacific University when she was doing work on belugas, is going to talk about her study and how that relates to the Cook Inlet belugas. And we're trying to show our audience what sorts of projects that students could get involved in if they're interested in this kind of work. So thanks, Paul, thanks, Jill, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. And please come back on Tuesday to see our next webinar. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.